Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back again with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard, for our continued exploration in the corruption files. As insane as some of these cases may have been or will be in the future, we're going to talk to you today about two of the most insane, and that's Petrobras and Odebrecht/Braskem. So, Mike, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. I'm looking forward to diving into these two Brazilian cases, which are both near and dear to my heart.
So Odebrecht was announced in December 2016, Petrobras September 2018. But I wanted to start with Petrobras because this was the start of car wash. Lava Jato was around Petrobras. Petrobras, I think, at one point employed 10% of the Brazilian workforce. They were as ubiquitous in the country of Brazil as any one non-governmental entity can be, and they, of course, were a governmental entity because they were the national oil company. They were the personal piggy bank of the ruling party, and when times were good, times were good. And they concealed bribery schemes in literally almost every transaction that they engaged in. The fines and penalties, there was a overall $2.95 billion in fines paid. The thing that made Petrobras probably take it to the next level was the offshoots or other companies that got into trouble. We're going to talk about Odebrecht and Braskem at $3.2 billion, SMB offshore $238 million, Keppel offshore $422 million, and the venerable Rolls-Royce got caught for $890 million. So we had over $5 billion in fines revolved around Petrobras. The Petrobras had corruption built into their structure, and this was not them paying, this was them receiving, because every service company in the world literally wanted to work for Petrobras. I worked for couple of those companies in Houston, and we did work for Petrobras, and we got caught up in little parts of that. They were as ubiquitous as they could be. One of my favorites, we were laughing about this in the green room. There was a chemical company bought by a Dutch company for a couple $100 million, and within 12 months, Petrobras bought it for $1.7 billion, I think. And the Dutch company kicked back the proceeds to Petrobras. Petrobras employees stealing, or senior executives stealing money from their own company. Another company I was with, we were a subcontractor. We were required to use a Petrobras-approved supplier who supplied manpower, and we were feather-bedded, meaning that we paid for 3 employees from the subcontractor but got 2. And the difference was kicked back to Petrobras purchasing. But Mike, the thing that I tried to communicate them, well, perhaps I should stop there and not go into lessons learned. What were some of your original thoughts in rereading about this insane case?
Yeah, I think, and maybe it's worth here just sort of putting this in the context of the broader Operation Car Wash Lava Jato investigation that came out of Brazil, which started really as a small money laundering investigation into how gas stations, how petrol stations in Brazil were being used to launder money, and basically they investigators sort of caught one of these black market money launderers, currency dealers, whatever there's a Portuguese term for that, and I'm going to butcher, so I won't even try to use it. But dealing with a high-level Petrobras official, and the light bulb went off and said, "Let's look at this." And it you've already talked about the outcome of it. It ends up with not just Petrobras, but all these other companies inside and outside of Brazil. And so when that operation was such big news, really till very recently. I think it just the investigation just was shut down at some point last year. But it touched so much, from the very highest levels of Brazilian politics to presidents in other countries. It was such a big part of practicing in this area for so many years, which is why I made the comment about this case being near and dear to my heart. And Petrobras was the center of it. It was the absolute epicenter of this investigation, and all of the other drama that rolled off of it started here. So when I went back to reread this, I think one of the things that I certainly knew at the time and remember now, but sort of gets lost in the confusion here, the actual bribes that Petrobras itself is accused of making, because as you mentioned, it was really them taking bribes. It was Petrobras officials taking bribes from various contractors. What they're accused of paying are bribes to other Brazilian officials, political parties, in return for basically for some of the executives keeping their spots at Petrobras so they can continue the scheme. It was sort of on this feedback loop. And I had sort of forgotten that, and it raises some, I think, interesting questions from an FCPA legal perspective. And the other piece of it that I'd kind of forgotten about a little bit too was not just the spin-off cases in terms of, we mentioned Odebrecht and others, but also all the litigation that came out of this in terms of shareholder class actions. Some of that stuff is still going on that really kind of, they paid, what was it you said? I can't remember the number that Petrobras paid, but that's only a portion of what they paid. That aside from the cost of the investigation, they paid another, $2.6 billion in shareholder litigation, and there's still more to come. So this has just been so wide-ranging and far-reaching. It's incredible.
Thanks for bringing that up, because that's a really important point that I want to emphasize, and that's the shareholder litigation. This was by a factor of, I can't even calculate how high a factor, of increase in payment in shareholder derivative litigation against a company. Over $2.6 billion paid. I think the highest one to date had been in the range of $100 million. And I certainly understand the maxim that bad facts make bad law, but when you create bad law, it's still law, even if it was because of some very bad facts. And now we have literal precedent for a $2 billion plus shareholder litigation settlement for directly against a company. And once you have that standard set, it may be an outlier, just like Siemens was for many years in the FCPA world. It's been exceeded many times now, and I'm afraid to say that D&O coverage will have to look at that case, and I think they have to factor that into their rate structure, because, like I said, once you get one out there, it's no longer unprecedented. So that case was certainly significant. That got a lot of people's attentions, and the invidiousness of this case, Mike. We had an ex-president, President Lula, went to prison over bribes around this. We had a sitting president, Dilma, who was thrown out because of this case. But the corruption went down many levels below simply the presidents of Brazil, and they were able to keep this bribery scheme going. And in terms of tips of the hats to the Brazilian judges and prosecutors in this case, I don't think you could have had a more difficult time when literally your biggest company in the country was leading this effort, yet they went after these individuals and a whole host of others. So I think those judges really put it on the line, and they developed some very good relationships with U.S. prosecutors over this case, and I think the results of those relationships are still being felt today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the, I think, longest lasting impacts potentially of this is that relationship that developed between the MPF and others in Brazil and U.S. and other foreign regulators, because as we'll see with some of the other settlements and resolutions that came out of this, it wasn't just the U.S. and Brazil. You've got Switzerland involved, kind of getting involved. You have, you have Singapore, I think, in one case. So, but really establishing a credibility and capability and capacity, if I can use three terms to describe kind of what the Brazilian authorities did with this case and the others around Operation Car Wash, that I think really will have long-lasting implications for Brazil's ability to participate in these large-scale corruption investigations, both in Brazil and potentially outside of Brazil.
Mike, some of the bribery schemes in this case are things I really wanted to visit with you about, because I found them, in addition to being so invidious, so difficult to detect. So in many cases, we had a U.S.-based or Western Europe-based energy service company who would get a master agreement with Petrobras for an amount not to exceed, and $2 billion, $3 billion, $4 billion, $5 billion for the contract. And the Petrobras would overcharge, or rather the company would overcharge, and or Petrobras would overpay, and then funds were kicked back to the individual Petrobras employees. We had other situations where the fraudulent price was baked into the bid. So once again, it was not unusual to have a contract of $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion. And what I struggled with was, how could you counsel a compliance professional who would be very comfortable looking at a third-party agent, seeing the value they brought to the company in terms of whatever it may be, in the context of their payment? If it was an hourly payment, it was a commission at 5% or less. If it was a fixed fee, that seemed reasonable. But I found no way simply that a compliance professional could look at one of these massive contracts and determine whether the price was reasonable or not. And I wonder, did you have those kinds of conversations with clients?
Yeah, I think you raised a couple of interesting points. And one is certainly the difficulty of detecting some of these schemes, and especially when you have this cartel that was entirely really outside of Petrobras coming to these agreements about what the price was going to be. So, it's not a case where you can look at the various bids and say, well, why do we go with this one, which was $2 million higher than the rest? Because they were all, they had agreed in advance. So they were submitting proposals in order to avoid detection. So it would be almost impossible. You're absolutely right. Almost impossible for a compliance officer to look at this, even to take a detailed look at this, and say, this is, why are we paying so much for this? It really would, unless you had a compliance officer that had specific experience in this exact same type of procurement at another exactly situated company. It would be almost impossible. I think what we counsel clients in this area is make sure that you have procurement controls that can control this as best as possible, so that you're doing a lowest cost, highest quality type analysis, and that there's multiple people involved in those decisions, multiple escalating levels for higher value bids, and then providing training and certifications and everything else for your people involved in the procurement process. So at the very least, you're getting those people to certify that, hey, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not aware of anything wrong. I took the training. I believe in the training. All of these things that really help protect the company, even if you ultimately can't prevent what was just a very, very hard to detect type of misconduct. One of the things I wanted to mention was all of this to say, and Petrobras has made this argument a number of times in different contexts, is, when you look at this, in some ways, Petrobras comes across as a victim in a lot of ways in this. And I know that they've tried to make that argument, but, it was the individual Petrobras employees that were benefiting. It's hard to come up with an argument for how Petrobras itself benefited from this scheme. If you look at it from the shareholder side, you might say, well, they benefited by these not disclosing these poor controls and basically being able to take our money at whether it was borrowed or purchased at a higher share price. But it really is, unlike most other FCPA cases, it's really hard to find where the benefit to Petrobras fell here. Right.
In the example I gave of the company I was with where feather bedding was going on, it brought up an entirely different set of bribery schemes, but it touched on something you said, Mike, that I wanted to follow up on, and that is procurement and the supply chain. So in my situation, we were direct subcontractor to Petrobras, but we were required under our contract to have other Brazilian subcontractors who had met Petrobras approved guidelines. So whether it was one or three, and we didn't necessarily connect what was going on with our payment to our subcontractors with a bribe to Petrobras. We felt comfortable that we weren't making a bribe, and none of our employees engaged in a bribe. But it turns out we were funding bribes through the subcontractors. So this case really, I thought, put a harsh spotlight on the procurement side and why anti-bribery, anti-corruption compliance professionals needed to have visibility into their company's supply chains.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think sometimes it's overlooked. We talk about on this podcast a number of times and highlighted the dangers around third-party agents and that type of engagement, that type of contract, and how you'd have these really strict due diligence procedures around that. We don't talk as much about suppliers and the supply chain, and part of that's for good reason. And just in general, it's lower risk. If you're actually receiving goods, it tends to be lower risk. But there's certainly risk involved, absolutely. And so, building in those controls, having compliance, involvement, insight is important for these reasons in particular we just discussed. I think the feather bedding and the much larger supply chain corruption that we saw with this Petrobras case that we're talking about now, it's the risks are certainly there for abuse, and so you really want to be looking to make sure you have appropriate controls to at least manage that risk.
So let's change our focus now to as wild as Petrobras was. This next one may be the most wild, and that's Odebrecht and its little brother Braskem. So why don't you take the lead on this one?
Sure, and I think we wrote this up for our annual alert a few years ago, and I'm just going to steal one sentence from our write-up because I think just encapsulates this perfectly. So what we wrote, which is true, is that Odebrecht admitted to paying approximately $788 million in bribes over the course of 15 years in 12 countries. So if there's one takeaway from this case, it is just how massive and broad the corruption was, and that really goes to this theme that comes through as you learn and read about the Odebrecht case, which is this was institutional corruption on the highest level. So Odebrecht was at the time, I think, the largest construction company in Latin America, and had grown from a family business to be this massive organization in Brazil, and they created a division of structured operations, I believe is what they called it. If you listen to the prosecutors, it was a department of bribery is really what it was. And this organization, this division within the larger Odebrecht family tree, was separate. So they separated everything. They had separate books, they had separate computer systems, they had separate messaging apps. All of that was to protect exactly what they were doing, which was funneling money all over the world through shell companies, which were also kept separate and hidden from the rest of the organization, to government officials all over the place. Now, about half of the money that they allegedly paid, or that they admitted to paying, went to Brazil, and most of that to Petrobras. So they were, Odebrecht was one of those cartel companies. They were one of the companies in the cartel that was dealing with Petrobras. But they also paid bribes all over Latin America and parts of Africa, and have as sort of wide-ranging as the Petrobras case was in terms of reaching high levels of Brazil. Odebrecht's case was equally as far-reaching in reaching the highest levels of other countries. In Peru, you had former president implicated. In Panama, I think that the sons of the president there were fugitives for a while. So really far-ranging. And then, just because this Department of Bribery wasn't quite enough, they also did things like good old fashioned money drops, cash drops, right in the heart of Sao Paulo, and dropping. They had a Chinese black market money smuggler, appropriately nicknamed Dragon, who would drop suitcases full of cash at specific locations. So this went from the most sophisticated schemes you can imagine to the good old fashioned basics of corruption here. And ultimately, I believe Odebrecht paid about $2.6 million, if I'm not mistaken. The fine was higher. The fine was $4.5 billion, but they paid $2.6 billion after making a presentation on their inability to pay the full amount, which was accepted by the Department of Justice and a judge in the Eastern District of New York. And they also, this was, I think it's important to point out, this was a joint effort here. This is another big swing and big victory for Brazilian authorities. The Swiss were also involved, and ultimately of that amount, the U.S. only took a really pretty small portion. I think of the $2.6 billion, I think the U.S. only $93 million went to the U.S. And it was a similar breakdown. Braskem, which was a subsidiary of Odebrecht, who was involved in corruption with Petrobras. They agreed to a penalty of $630 million, and the SEC took $65 million, and I think the U.S. took around $90 million. So most of the funds here went to Brazilian authorities and to some to Swiss authorities as well.
This was as ubiquitous a bribery scheme that we have seen since Siemens, and no doubt inspired by the Siemens model. But I've got a list of countries where Odebrecht paid bribes, and I won't go through the amounts paid or the benefits, but I just want to read the list to show you how ubiquitous this business model was for Odebrecht. In addition to Brazil, Angola, Argentina, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Mozambique, Panama, Peru, Venezuela. And they were investigated literally anywhere Odebrecht did business, including in the great state of Texas, as well they should have been. The courage to take on Marcelo Odebrecht and his brothers, I think, in addition to what we talked about in terms of Petrobras, was really unparalleled. He literally, called up the president and said, "Come by and see me," not "Can I come see you?" You need to come see me. And that was the kind of power he held. And their operations were literally on a worldwide basis. And so the resources that were brought to bear to bring this down, and in addition to the original sentence of 19 years, I think I recall some 200 Odebrecht executives were criminally prosecuted in Brazil, and they were part of the Department of Structured Operations, or as our Justice Department called it, their Department of Bribery. Mike, this case, I'm glad you laid out some of the bribery schemes, because they were much more mundane than we saw in Petrobras. But how do you begin to think through, in counseling a client around doing business with this company? Is it that you have to start literally building blocks in terms of, we now need to look at every contract, we need to build up to see what their overall spend is? If you are in the construction industry in the late 90s, aughts, or even in the second decade of this century, anywhere in the world, you may have done business with Odebrecht. How do you help a company think through an enforcement action of this magnitude?
It's a good question. It's hard, oftentimes we talk about these cases and we try to draw lessons. If you're a compliance officer at a company, what lesson do you draw? It's really hard to draw a lesson for something like this. I mean, this bribery was so institutionalized that if you were a compliance officer here, it's hard to draw a lesson from something this big and broad. How do you prevent something like this? So I think what we've had a lot coming out of this is clients who have done business with Odebrecht and said, what do we do now? Right? Let's say we had a joint venture with them, or we worked on the contract, we were subcontractors to them. What risk exposure do we have? Do we need to investigate every single contract that we had that they were involved in? And I think, that's ultimately sort of a risk analysis that we've advised our clients on. We have, there's certainly been cases, particularly where, a number of Odebrecht's contracts were funded by multilateral development banks, and they ultimately settled not too long ago with the Inter-American Development Bank related to this same scheme for a project that the Inter-American Development Bank had funded. So when we have clients who worked with Odebrecht on development bank projects, we suggested, hey, you might want to take a look, because there's a chance that those development banks are going to look. But it's really difficult. I mean, the other part of this, it's so difficult. If you kind of go back in time before this all broke, I mean, Odebrecht was one of the most successful and prominent construction companies in the world. So there's certainly no red flag to doing a joint venture with them, or to being a subcontractor or being involved in a project with them, right? This is not something that due diligence would necessarily help you discover. And so, we always recommend certifications from joint venture partners. That's not a perfect defense, but in situations like this, where it can be so difficult to sort of identify any of this beforehand, that can be helpful. That's a helpful piece of paper to show a potential prosecutor in the future.
That really also brings up an interesting point that I wanted to visit with you about in terms of the fallout from this case. I read off that list of countries. I talked about the number of Odebrecht employees who were criminally prosecuted. You talked about the political fallout, largely in Latin America and Central America and Mexico, around doing business with Odebrecht. But do companies really need to start thinking about not due diligence on our third-party sales agents, but really who are we doing business with? Because if this company does either have a negative reputation, or we don't see the controls in place that we would typically see and the robustness around compliance, does that become a reputational risk that they could get drawn into something far beyond their control, nevertheless have their name dragged through the mud, which unfortunately some companies got that in the Odebrecht enforcement action.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we tell clients all the time, anytime you're partnering or working closely with another company, you're taking on potential risk, right? Especially, and the closer that relationship is, the more risk you take on. There's different risk in a joint venture, a project joint venture compared to a longer-term joint venture. There's different risk in consortiums, and so absolutely. And all you can really do. I mean, people aren't going to stop doing business, so all you can really do as a company dealing with that is try to know your partners as best as possible. Try to build in controls to the partnership to make sure that if you're in a JV with another construction company, that joint venture has appropriate controls, and try as best you can to do diligence on the front end to get commitments from your joint venture or consortium partner or whatever it may be, that they're doing things in the right way. That's can kind of be the most you can do, right? We had some questions. I remember sort of flipping to the other side of the world a little bit. After some of the larger, settlements involving, some of the telecommunications companies that we discussed a few episodes ago, we had questions from clients who did business with those companies saying, "Can we still do business with them?" And the answer is you can't not do business with them. And just because a company has had an issue doesn't necessarily mean everything they touch is tainted. But you try to get commitments and make sure you are protected as best as you can.
So, Mike, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode because we've been saving the big one. We're going to do 1MDB, but this has been a great episode, and the lessons that we've struggled to give our clients, I think, are still important to give today. And in reviewing these, I guess two things that struck me, that one has been a theme of this podcast, which is I forgot how insane these cases were. And they still are. But number two, there really are a lot of important lessons. And the more sophisticated the bribery scheme, perhaps the bigger lesson of the work you need to do if you're on the other side of the table from one of these companies, either in a contractual relationship in a joint venture, or perhaps even negotiating or responding to an RFP. So lots to learn.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was fun, and I'm looking forward to talking about Joe Lowe and his friends in the next episode.